Hi, this is Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek. Who are the wicked? Most people would think of the wicked as really evil people like Hitler, Jack the Ripper, Charles Manson, or maybe Nero or Caligula. Some would point to drug dealers, child molesters, or mass murderers, but Psalm 9:17 says, "The wicked will return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God." So the Bible defines the wicked as people who forget God. Think about that. The most upright citizen who works a respectable job and pays their taxes, mows their lawn, or maybe even donates to charity, if they neglect God and go through life never thinking about spiritual things, God calls them wicked. At the same time, the prisoner who is locked up for 20 years for murder, or maybe even on death row, if they recognize their sinfulness and place their trust in Jesus and seek Him, the Bible calls them righteous. This is so counterintuitive for us because, as God told Samuel, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. God doesn't see the sin of those who acknowledge their sin and cry out for mercy, but for those who fail to recognize their sin, their guilt remains. Psalm 14, verse 1 says that the fool says in his heart, "There is no God." We usually interpret this as referring to atheists, but that's not necessarily the case. Even people who believe in God can act like they don't believe. When you do something that you know is wrong, you have to temporarily convince yourself that you can get away with it somehow. Maybe God isn't looking, or maybe He'll let you off easy. Romans 1:18 says, "For God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness and unrighteousness of people who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." That's what we do when we forget God. We suppress the truth. The glory of God that is revealed in His creation is screaming at us every day to seek Him, trust Him, live for Him, and glorify Him. We have to suppress the testimony of the stars in the sky and the birds in the air and the waves of the ocean in order to forget God. We have to ignore the clear teaching of the Bible to convince ourselves that there's no such thing as the day of God's wrath and eternal judgment. 2 Peter 3:5 says that people who do this are willingly ignorant. Not just ignorant, but willingly ignorant. They choose to be that way. Why? Because they don't want to think about it. It's not a pleasant thought. Well, I'm all for thinking happy thoughts, but only when those thoughts are consistent with the truth of God's Word. God has an incredible eternity awaiting those who don't forget Him, but that's not the case for those who do. In Deuteronomy 6:12, God told Israel, "Then take care lest you forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery." Think about all the miracles God did in delivering Israel from bondage in Egypt. The plagues that came upon Egypt, crossing the Red Sea on dry land, drowning the Egyptians as they pursued Israel, the manna from heaven, the cloud that led them in the daytime and the pillar of fire by night. And with all of that, Israel had a tendency to forget what God had done for them and grow cold toward Him. In Matthew 16, Jesus warned His disciples about the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. When His disciples said, "He said that because we didn't bring any bread," Jesus said, "You of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered?" Then they realized that He was referring to the teaching of the Pharisees. But it strikes me as interesting that after feeding the multitude supernaturally on 2 different occasions, they were worried about not having enough food. Then right before His crucifixion, He instituted the sacrament of communion, telling them to eat the bread and drink the wine in remembrance of Him until He returns. We all have a tendency to fall into the trap of forgetting God and relying on the laws of the natural that we deal with every day. It's part of our fallen human nature. But that nature is evil. And if we don't remind ourselves of all that God has done, how good God is, how faithful He is, we can allow that evil to draw us back into thinking and acting like the world. So don't suppress the truth. Recognize God's handiwork. Meditate on His word day and night. Speak in agreement with His word. Live like it's true, because it is. Your flesh doesn't want to acknowledge that. That's why we have to crucify the flesh and walk in the Spirit, because it's only in our regenerated spirits, where God's Spirit lives, that we can take hold of the truth of God's word and make it a reality in our lives. Be blessed.